Between 1979 and 1983, the FBI conducted the most ambitious study in the history of criminal psychology. Agents from the Behavioral Science Unit traveled to prisons across America and sat face-to-face with 36 convicted serial killers: Ted Bundy, Edmund Kemper, John Wayne Gacy, Dennis Rader. From those interviews, they constructed a profiling framework that would define how the entire world understands serial murder for the next half-century. But there was a fundamental flaw built into the foundation. Every single subject in that study was male. And the women who killed, sometimes at scales that dwarfed their male counterparts, would exploit that blind spot for decades. In 1972, the FBI established its Behavioral Science Unit at the Academy in Quantico, Virginia. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of simply reacting to violent crime after the fact, agents like Robert Ressler and John Douglas believed they could get ahead of it by crawling inside the minds of serial offenders and mapping how they think. The landmark study that followed became the bedrock of modern criminal profiling. Over 4 years, Ressler and Douglas personally interviewed dozens of incarcerated serial killers, some of the most notorious names in American criminal history. From those conversations, they extracted patterns, behavioral signatures, psychological markers that could help investigators narrow suspect pools before an arrest was even made, and it worked brilliantly. The organized versus disorganized offender classification, geographical profiling, escalation patterns. Staging analysis. These concepts revolutionized law enforcement and became the gold standard taught to investigators on every continent. But here's the thing nobody thought to question at the time. The entire theoretical framework, every pattern, every typology, every predictive model, was built from a sample that systematically excluded roughly 15% of all serial killers, the ones who were women. Not because anyone deliberately decided women weren't worth studying, but because the prevailing assumption was so deeply embedded that it functioned as an invisible filter. Serial killers are men. If serial killers are men, then studying men is studying serial killers. The logic was circular, and it would prove catastrophic. The template that emerged from those Quantico interviews painted a very specific picture. The typical serial killer was male, usually white, between 25 and 35 years old. He was a social outsider, a loner who struggled to form meaningful relationships. He targeted strangers. He used physical violence, strangulation, stabbing, blunt force trauma. He left crime scenes that told a story of domination and sexual control. He kept trophies. He revisited his crimes. He escalated. And law enforcement agencies around the world internalized this template so deeply that it became something far more dangerous than a guideline. It became a lens. When a string of suspicious deaths appeared, in a hospital ward, in a family home, at a nursing facility, and the evidence didn't match the Quantico profile, the default conclusion wasn't that the profile might be incomplete. The default conclusion was that there was no serial killer. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias operating at an institutional scale. The very framework designed to detect serial murder contained a built-in filter that rendered an entire category of serial murder effectively invisible. If the deaths weren't violent, if the victims weren't strangers, if there was no sexual component, if the suspect didn't fit the narrow demographic, the profiling framework delivered a single, confident verdict. This isn't what you think it is. Move on, and investigators did, for decades. Female serial killers don't just differ from their male counterparts in degree. They differ in almost every measurable dimension. Nearly every behavioral variable that defines the FBI's original profiling framework inverts when applied to women who kill serially. Start with method. Male serial killers overwhelmingly use direct physical violence, strangulation, stabbing, bludgeoning, firearms. Women favor what criminologists call quiet kill methods: poison, suffocation, medication tampering, deliberate medical neglect, lethal injection. These methods leave minimal forensic evidence. In many cases, they leave no detectable evidence at all. Victim selection is equally divergent. Male serial killers typically target strangers, people they encounter opportunistically or stalk from a distance. Women almost exclusively target people within their sphere of care: patients, children, elderly dependents, spouses. People whose deaths generate sympathy and condolence, not suspicion and investigation. Then there's setting. Male serial killers tend to operate in spaces associated with danger: isolated roadsides, vacant lots, dark alleys. Women operate in spaces associated with safety: hospitals, family homes, nurseries, care facilities, places where death, while always tragic, is a recognized and expected possibility. And motive. The Quantico framework emphasized sexual sadism, dominance, and power as primary drivers. But research by criminologists like Eric Hickey and Marissa Harrison at Penn State found that female serial killers are driven by fundamentally different forces: financial gain, perceived mercy, attention-seeking through Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or a quiet compulsion that has no direct analog in the male offender literature. The FBI wasn't just missing a few details. It was studying an entirely different species of predator. Here's the detail that makes this blind spot so devastating in practice. Female serial killers don't just evade detection because their methods are forensically subtle. They evade detection because they embed themselves in environments where death is a normal, expected outcome. Think carefully about a hospital intensive care unit. Patients in the ICU die every single day. It's devastating for families, but it's statistically expected. When an elderly patient on a geriatric ward codes during the night shift, the first assumption is organ failure, not homicide. When a critically ill premature infant in a neonatal unit stops breathing, the default explanation is that the underlying condition was simply too severe. When a home hospice patient declines faster than projected, well, terminal timelines are inherently unpredictable. Now imagine a killer who intuitively understands all of this, who deliberately positions herself in exactly these roles: nurse, midwife, care aide, devoted mother, where her presence at the scene of death isn't just unremarkable, it's expected. It's even comforting to the families around her. She's the dedicated nurse who was right there when it happened, the mother who discovered her child not breathing, the caretaker who tried everything she could. The institutional camouflage isn't a side benefit of the crime. It is the entire architecture of the crime, and the profiling framework built at Quantico had absolutely no mechanism to see through it, because it was built by studying men who killed in ways that looked nothing like this. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This isn't a modern problem. This blind spot is centuries old. To understand just how far back this blind spot reaches, we need to travel to Victorian England. Amelia Dyer was a trained nurse and midwife in Bristol, who, beginning in the 1860s, offered a service that was both common and perfectly legal at the time: baby farming. Unmarried mothers, working-class families who couldn't afford another child, women whose pregnancies were socially catastrophic. They would pay Dyer a lump sum to take their newborn and place it in a suitable home. It was adoption before formal adoption systems existed. Except Dyer wasn't placing children anywhere. She was killing them. For over 30 years, Dyer accepted infants, collected her fee, and then murdered them, typically through deliberate starvation, neglect, or strangulation with a length of white edging tape. She wrapped the tiny bodies in brown paper parcels and dropped them into the River Thames. 30 years. Researchers estimate between 200 and 400 victims. If the higher estimates are accurate, Amelia Dyer may be the most prolific serial killer in British history, possibly in all of Western recorded history. She was finally caught in 1896 when a bargeman fished a paper parcel from the Thames near Reading, and police traced the wrapping paper back to her address. At her trial, Dyer reportedly told investigators a single chilling sentence: "You'll know all mine by the tape around their necks." But here's what makes this case so foundational for understanding the blind spot. Dyer was not operating in secret. She was operating inside a system. Baby farming was a recognized cottage industry. Multiple infants in her care had died over the decades, and authorities had investigated briefly, superficially, without urgency. Each time, the deaths were chalked up to natural causes. Infant mortality in Victorian England was staggeringly high. Babies died constantly. And a woman tending to babies was the very last person anyone thought to suspect. Amelia Dyer didn't need to hide. The world hid her. Half a world away and half a century later, the same blind spot enabled killing on an almost incomprehensible scale. Miyuki Ishikawa was the director of a maternity hospital, the Katabuki Clinic in post-war Tokyo. Japan in the late 1940s was a shattered nation. The economy was in ruins. Food was desperately scarce. And unwanted births were surging among families who could barely keep themselves alive, let alone support another child. Ishikawa's response was methodical and devastatingly cold. She simply stopped providing care to newborns whose parents she deemed unable or unwilling to raise them. No food, no warmth, no medical intervention of any kind. She let them die of exposure and starvation. Then she arranged for the quiet disposal of the remains. The estimated death toll ranges between 85 and over 160 infants. The precise number will never be established, because records were destroyed and many births were never officially documented. When authorities finally discovered the remains, dozens of tiny bodies found in mass disposal sites near the hospital, Ishikawa expressed zero remorse. Her defense was terrifying in its calculated rationality. She argued that the parents bore primary responsibility for abandoning their children, that she was merely allowing what was already inevitable. That in a nation starving and broken by war, these deaths were pragmatism, not murder. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The Japanese legal system, confronted with evidence of serial killing on an industrial scale, could not fully process what it was seeing. When convicted in 1948, Miyuki Ishikawa received just 4 years in prison. Sentence was later reduced on appeal, partly because the court accepted her argument that parental culpability was a significant mitigating factor. A woman responsible for over 100 infant deaths received a lighter sentence than many single-offense convictions carry today, because the cognitive framework of that era could not accommodate the reality that a hospital director, a woman in a caretaking role, was a serial predator. She was treated as negligent, careless at worst. Not as what she actually was. If you think this kind of blind spot closed as forensic science advanced through the 20th century, the evidence is devastating. In San Antonio, Texas, in the early 1980s, pediatric nurse Jenny Jones was responsible for a terrifying spike in infant emergencies and deaths. Jones worked in a pediatric intensive care unit where she would inject children with succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant that causes respiratory paralysis and cardiac arrest. Then she would leap into action, performing dramatic resuscitation attempts in full view of colleagues and parents. Sometimes the children survived her heroics, sometimes they didn't. Colleagues noticed the pattern. An alarming number of code blue emergencies on Jones's shifts and almost no one else's. But when nurses raised concerns, Bexar County Hospital's administration did not investigate for a potential serial killer. Instead, they quietly replaced the entire ICU nursing staff in a deliberate personnel shuffle designed to make the anomaly disappear. Medical records related to the suspicious deaths were shredded. Jenny Jones simply moved to a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, and continued killing. This pattern repeats across the globe with disturbing consistency. In Ontario, Canada, nurse Elizabeth Wetlaufer murdered 8 elderly patients through deliberate insulin overdoses between 2007 and 2014, a 7-year killing spree. She was caught only because she confessed during a rehabilitation therapy session, not through forensic investigation, not through profiling, through her own confession. In Oldenburg, Germany, nurse Niels Hergel killed at least 85 patients and was initially overlooked for years. In Lugo, Italy, nurse Daniela Poggiali was investigated after a suspicious pattern of potassium chloride deaths at her hospital. And in the UK, the case of nurse Lucy Letby, convicted in 2023 of murdering 7 newborns, revealed that even in the modern era, healthcare institutions can delay meaningful investigation for years while a killer continues to operate. None of these killers were caught by criminal profiling, not one. Jenny Jones's case warrants a deeper examination because it exposes something far more troubling than individual cognitive bias. It reveals institutional complicity, not through malice, but through a collective failure of imagination. When infant deaths spiked on Jones's shifts at Bexar County Hospital, administrators faced a stark choice. Investigate the possibility that a nurse, one of their own employees, a woman entrusted to care for the most vulnerable patients in the building, was systematically killing children, or find another explanation. They chose another explanation. Every single time: equipment malfunction, statistical anomaly, staffing shortages, tragic coincidence. Anything, literally anything, rather than confront the possibility that violated their fundamental understanding of who commits serial murder. And when those alternative explanations became untenable, they still didn't escalate to law enforcement. They shuffled the staff. They shredded the records. They buried it, not because they were consciously protecting a killer, but because the alternative was, in the most literal psychological sense, unthinkable to them. Social psychologists have a precise term for this phenomenon: schemo-incongruent information processing. When evidence directly contradicts a deeply embedded mental model, the human brain doesn't update the model. It reinterprets the evidence. It finds an explanation, any explanation, that preserves the existing schema intact. Dead infants on a nurse's shift don't indicate murder. They indicate a challenging patient population, inadequate resources, a difficult stretch of bad outcomes. The evidence isn't denied. It's reframed, recontextualized, made to fit a model that cannot accommodate what's actually happening. And reframing at an institutional scale doesn't just delay justice, it buys killers years, sometimes decades. There's a compounding factor that makes detection even harder, and it comes down to basic forensic reality. A gunshot leaves a bullet, a stabbing leaves a wound track, strangulation leaves petechial hemorrhaging and hyoid bone fractures. Physical violence announces itself to anyone trained to look. But poison metabolizes. Suffocation by pillow leaves no marks distinguishable from natural respiratory failure. A deliberate insulin overdose mimics hypoglycemic crisis. Potassium chloride, injected intravenously, triggers cardiac arrest that looks identical to natural heart failure and becomes virtually undetectable within hours. And deliberate neglect, simply not feeding a patient, not administering prescribed medication, quietly withholding supplemental oxygen, produces a decline that is indistinguishable from the natural progression of disease. Because, in a medical sense, it is the natural progression. The killer simply removes the intervention that was preventing it. Now consider this. In the vast majority of these cases, autopsies were never performed. And why would they be? An elderly care home resident passed away in her sleep. A premature infant didn't survive the night. A hospice patient with a terminal diagnosis went more quickly than expected. These outcomes are heartbreaking, but they're not crime scenes. No one calls a forensic pathologist. In Amelia Dyer's Victorian England, infant mortality was so commonplace that dozens of deaths in one woman's care barely registered. In Ishikawa's post-war Japan, infant death was a demographic reality, not a forensic red flag. And in modern hospitals today, individual patient deaths only trigger investigation when there's visible trauma or a specific formal complaint. The weapon is invisible. The crime scene looks exactly like a place where people naturally die. It's a double layer of camouflage that no profiling framework was ever designed to penetrate. So how large is this blind spot in reality? How many victims slip through entirely? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we may never know. Criminologist Eric Hickey compiled one of the most comprehensive databases of serial killers ever assembled, spanning decades of research. His data suggests that roughly 15% of identified serial killers in the United States are women. But Hickey himself has cautioned, repeatedly, that this number almost certainly underrepresents reality, because his database, by definition, can only include killers who were eventually identified and caught, and that creates a vicious statistical circle. If the detection framework is biased against identifying female serial killers, then the data on female serial killers will always be incomplete. Incomplete data reinforces the perception that female serial killers are exceptionally rare. And that perception continues to bias the detection framework. The blind spot doesn't just persist, it perpetuates itself. Researchers call the gap between detected crime and actual crime the dark figure. For female serial murder specifically, that dark figure may be enormous and essentially unknowable. Consider just the duration gap. Studies consistently show that the average male serial killer operates for approximately 2 years before apprehension. The average female serial killer operates for 8. Some, like Amelia Dyer, killed for over 3 decades. Elizabeth Wettlaufer killed for 7 years and was only stopped by her own confession. Jennine Jones killed across multiple facilities over several years before a single meaningful intervention occurred. That duration differential isn't evidence that female serial killers are more intelligent or more sophisticated in their planning. It's evidence that the system simply is not calibrated to find them. They're not evading detection through skill. They're operating below its threshold entirely. The encouraging development, if you can call anything in this subject encouraging, is that the field has finally begun to correct itself. Slowly. In the early 2000s, researchers like Marissa Harrison at Penn State Harrisburg started publishing groundbreaking work that examined female serial killers as a distinct behavioral category rather than aberrations from the male norm. Harrison's research identified what she termed the comfort killer typology, offenders who operate within trusted relationships, employ quiet methods, and are driven by financial, psychological, or attention-seeking motives that the original Quantico framework never even considered as primary drivers of serial murder. The FBI's own profiling curriculum has gradually expanded since the late 1990s to acknowledge fundamental gender differences in serial offense patterns. And within healthcare specifically, organizations like the National Health Service in the UK have developed statistical early warning tools, monitoring systems designed to flag unusual clusters of patient deaths linked to specific staff members. The kind of pattern that, had it existed 40 years ago, might have caught Jennine Jones years earlier, might have saved dozens of children. But here's the honest reality. Changing a foundational paradigm is a generational project. The organized-disorganized dichotomy, the stranger-targeting loner profile, the emphasis on physical violence and sexual control as defining features of serial predation. These ideas are embedded so deeply in how investigators think, how prosecutors construct cases, how juries evaluate evidence, and how the general public imagines serial killers, that overcoming them requires more than better research papers and updated textbooks. It requires a fundamental rewiring of institutional intuition, because the most dangerous serial killer isn't always the stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it's the nurse adjusting your IV line, the midwife holding your newborn, the caretaker your family trusted with everything. The women in this video didn't match the profile. That was the whole point. Criminal profiling revolutionized how we catch killers, but it also cast a long shadow. A shadow where an entire category of predator could hide in plain sight, for years, for decades, for entire lifetimes. The question that should keep us up at night isn't whether the framework is finally being fixed. It's how many killers it missed while the world wasn't looking. If this changed how you think about criminal profiling, drop a comment. I genuinely want to know which case hit you the hardest. And if you want to go deeper into the cases the mainstream misses, subscribe. Because what's coming next makes this look like just the beginning.